Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. The distant hum of the car engine faded as Max turned into the final stretch of the quiet road leading home. The clock on the dashboard blinked 1:42 a.m., casting a cold, indifferent light across the interior of his SUV. Home, with its familiar warmth and promise of rest, stood ahead like a beacon. Yet, as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, they caught the sharp outline of a car parked in his driveway, its sleek, unfamiliar form gleaming under the silver wash of moonlight. The license plate was foreign, not one he'd ever seen in the neighborhood. Max's pulse quickened, a surge of unease climbing up his chest. He slowed down, coasting to a stop at the edge of the property as the first tendrils of suspicion coiled around him. For a brief moment, silence reigned. No rustle of leaves, no chirping of crickets, just a hollow, anticipatory quiet that pricked at the edges of his nerves. Drawing a deep breath, he scanned the scene. The living room window glowed softly with golden light, hinting at life within. A muffled burst of laughter, quickly cut short, filtered through the air, and Max's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The stillness that followed was suffocating. Max shifted the SUV into park, the engine idling for a moment before he cut it off. His eyes stayed glued to the unknown car in the driveway, a dark sedan with tinted windows that seemed too polished, too deliberate for this hour. His mind raced, piecing together reasons, excuses, anything that could rationalize its presence. But nothing made sense. The unease transformed into something sharper, tinged with the bitterness of doubt. He opened the car door slowly, the creak of its hinges splitting the silence. The night air felt colder than usual, seeping through his clothes and making him shiver. With measured steps, he approached the front of the house, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot steadying him. As he drew closer, he caught his reflection in the sedan's side mirror, tense, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. A flicker of shadow moved behind the curtains, and the laughter, no longer muffled but strained, dissipated abruptly. The voices that followed dropped to murmurs, barely distinguishable, but enough to tell him there were two distinct tones. One familiar, lilting and warm, the other, deeper, assertive. Max reached for the doorknob, his hand hesitating just a moment too long. The moment stretched out, heavy with dread and expectation. With a swift twist, he pushed the door open, the hinges groaning like a warning. Inside, the living room was bathed in the soft light of a lamp. The cozy, welcoming space now felt foreign, as if it belonged to someone else. The scent of perfume, Camilla's favorite, mingled with something musky and unfamiliar. His gaze swept the room in an instant, taking in every detail: the empty wine glasses on the coffee table, the throw pillows dislodged from the couch, and most tellingly, the silence that met his entrance. Then he saw them. Camilla stood rigid, her wide eyes locked on him, panic carving lines across her delicate features. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and she clutched the edge of her silk robe as if it were armor. Beside her, a man of imposing height turned slowly, a confident, unbothered smile flickering across his face. His posture spoke of boldness, as if Max's arrival was merely an interruption, not a confrontation. Max, Camilla's voice quivered, barely breaking the tension. It wasn't an explanation, not even an attempt at one. Just his name, spoken as if she'd hoped to push reality away by saying it. The stranger's smile hardened into a smirk as their eyes met, and a silent challenge hung between them, thick as smoke. Max's hands curled into fists at his sides, the tremor of restrained anger pulsing in his veins. But he drew in a breath, steeling himself against the hurricane of betrayal brewing inside. "So," Max finally said, his voice low and laced with biting sarcasm, "I didn't realize we had company." His eyes never left Camilla, though the words struck them both. She flinched, her lips parting to speak, but no sound came. The moment stretched out again, punctuated only by the ticking of the wall clock and the roaring silence between them. The silence in the room pressed down on them like a physical weight, charged with the unspoken. Max stood at the threshold, his sharp gaze bouncing between Camilla and the man who dared to meet his eyes with a mix of defiance and curiosity. It felt surreal, as though he'd stumbled onto the set of someone else's drama, not the life he'd built with careful attention and trust. Camilla shifted, the subtle rustle of her robe breaking the silence. The color drained from her cheeks as she struggled to find words, her breathing shallow and uneven. Max could see the war behind her eyes, the desperate search for an excuse that might salvage the moment, an explanation that would pull them all from this precipice. The man spoke first, his voice smooth and disturbingly casual. "You must be Max. I've heard a lot about you," he said, as if they were old acquaintances. He didn't bother extending a hand, and Max's stomach churned at the arrogance, the audacity of the man to stand there so composed. Max's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered to Camilla, who stood motionless, fingers still clutching her robe like a lifeline. There was a moment when their eyes met, and in that fleeting glance, he saw everything: fear, regret, and a plea she couldn't voice. It was all the confirmation he needed. A bitter smile curved his lips. "Heard a lot? Huh?" Max's tone was cold, biting. "I suppose this is where you two explain how this is all just a big misunderstanding." He tilted his head slightly, the sarcasm cutting deeper than any shout could. Camilla took a small step forward, the movement hesitant, as if testing the ground for hidden traps. "Max, please," she began, but her voice faltered. The sound of her own words seemed to betray her, crumbling under the weight of the truth. The man's smile faded, his expression hardening. He crossed his arms over his broad chest, shifting his stance just enough to show he wouldn't back down if challenged. The posturing was enough to send a fresh wave of anger coursing through Max's veins, but he held it back, barely. "Save it, Camilla." Max's voice dropped, the restraint in it like a taut wire. He exhaled slowly, his gaze boring into her with a coldness she had never seen before. "I won't turn this into a spectacle, but we both know what this means." Camilla's eyes brimmed with unshed tears, the reality sinking into her like a stone. There would be no arguing, no pleading that could undo this moment. The gravity of it was irreversible. The lover, sensing the shift, uncrossed his arms and glanced at Camilla, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through his facade. Max caught it, feeling a grim satisfaction twist in his chest. He wanted them both to feel this every second of the shame and discomfort. Max stepped back, reclaiming the space of the entrance. "I'll pack what I need and be gone by morning," he said flatly, his voice bereft of emotion. He turned and walked away, leaving behind the shudder of silence and the echo of consequences neither could ignore. Max's footsteps resounded through the hall, each thud a punctuation mark in the silence that enveloped the house. He moved with a sense of mechanical purpose, eyes fixed on the stairs as if climbing them would take him to some higher ground, a refuge from the betrayal festering below. His mind, though numbed by the shock, began to plot out the practicalities: a suitcase, a change of clothes, essentials. It kept his thoughts tethered, warding off the raw surge of emotions that threatened to break loose. Reaching the bedroom, he pushed the door open, the familiar creak now sounding ominous. The space seemed foreign, distant from the warmth it once held. The bed, with its neatly folded comforter, stared back at him, an unwelcome reminder of shared moments that now felt tainted. He crossed the room, opening the closet with a rough pull, and grabbed a duffel bag from the top shelf. Downstairs, muted whispers drifted up to him, urgent and uneven. Camilla's voice rose and fell, a strained attempt at damage control, but Max refused to parse the words. It didn't matter now. Whatever rationale she wove together wouldn't change the truth exposed in the living room. He tossed a few shirts and jeans into the bag, not caring if they wrinkled or folded properly. There was a detachment in his actions, as though he were watching someone else pack some faceless man dealing with his wife's infidelity. The weight of what had happened hadn't yet fully anchored in his chest. It loomed, threatening to hit with crushing force. But for now, adrenaline kept it at bay. A photograph on the dresser caught his eye, and he paused mid-motion. It was of the two of them at a beachside cafe, sunlit and smiling, unaware of the fractures that would one day splinter their lives. The frame felt heavy in his hand, an artifact from a simpler time. With a slow exhale, he placed it face down on the dresser, unable to confront its falsified memories. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed up the stairs. Camilla's voice, tentative and soft, called out, "Max, can we talk? Please?" The plea hung in the air, fragile and desperate. He turned, eyes hardening as he met her gaze. She stood at the doorway, her hand gripping the frame for support, the robe now closed tightly around her. Her eyes were red-rimmed, the tears now streaming freely. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "It's not what you think." A bitter laugh escaped him before he could stop it. "Not what I think. Camilla," I walked into it. "There's no spin you can put on this." His voice was low but sharp, cutting through the tension between them. She took a step forward, but Max raised a hand, stopping her. "Don't," he said, his tone void of warmth. "You've already said enough without words." The silence stretched between them longer this time, heavy with the finality of what they both knew was coming. Without another word, he zipped up the bag and slung it over his shoulder, brushing past her as he left the room. As Max descended the stairs, the duffel bag slung over his shoulder, a new, icy determination settled in his chest. Each step echoed loudly in his mind, marking the final moments of the life he had known. The house, once a sanctuary filled with laughter and shared moments, now felt suffocating, a hollow shell where secrets had festered unseen. The air downstairs was thick with tension. Camilla had followed him, her breath shaky, fingers twisting nervously at the hem of her robe. The man, still standing in the living room, had shifted his posture from bold arrogance to uneasy silence. The confident smirk had vanished, replaced with a watchful stare that darted between Max and Camilla. He seemed unsure of his place now, as if realizing for the first time the extent of the havoc he'd contributed to. Max set his jaw as he approached the front door. He could feel Camilla's presence behind him, could hear the faint intake of her breath as she struggled to speak. "Max, wait," she said, her voice cracking under the strain. "Please let me explain. This isn't how it was supposed to be." He turned his head slightly, not enough to meet her eyes. "You're right about one thing," he said, his tone sharp and unforgiving. "This isn't how it was supposed to be, but here we are." The words hung between them like a blade. Camilla reached out a trembling hand, but let it fall before it reached him, as if she'd already realized the futility of the gesture. Max's eyes met hers for the briefest moment, and he saw the storm of guilt, the frantic search for anything that could undo what had been done. But no such words came. The silence was broken by the man's cough, a defensive, awkward sound. It was a reminder of his presence, a jarring intrusion into what had once been a sacred space. Max turned fully this time, his gaze icy and unwavering. "You," he said, the single word laden with contempt. "I suggest you leave." The man's eyes flickered with defiance, but it quickly waned under the force of Max's stare. He nodded once, curtly, and walked past them without another word. The sound of the front door closing behind him reverberated through the house, leaving an emptiness in its wake. Camilla sank onto the armrest of the couch, her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of her actions had finally settled on her. The room, bathed in soft lamplight, seemed almost cruel in its familiarity. Max could feel her eyes on him, silently begging for something acknowledgement, a chance, anything. But he had nothing left to give. "I'll be back for the rest of my things," Max said, each syllable a nail in the coffin of their marriage. "And don't call me. Don't try to explain. There's nothing you can say that will change this." Camilla buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled but unmistakable. Max turned away, the duffel bag bouncing lightly against his side as he moved. He reached for the doorknob, the cold metal biting against his palm, and took one last look at the house that had been theirs. Then, without hesitation, he stepped outside into the crisp night air, closing the door on everything he had once trusted. The cold night air hit Max with a startling sharpness, clearing the fog of disbelief from his mind. He paused on the porch, taking a moment to steel himself against the tremor of emotion that threatened to overtake him. The silence outside was vast, a stark contrast to the turmoil he had just walked out of. The distant hum of crickets and the rustle of leaves were the only sounds, mocking in their simplicity. Max descended the porch steps slowly, each step deliberate as if to keep himself from turning back. The driveway stretched before him, the unfamiliar car now abandoned and irrelevant. It was just metal and rubber, a witness to the unraveling of his marriage. His own car stood next to it, a familiar refuge now cast in a different light. He dropped the duffel bag into the back seat with a muted thump and stood there for a moment, hands gripping the edge of the open car door. His reflection in the window looked as haunted as he felt hollow eyes, clenched jaw, a man suddenly unmoored from everything he had anchored his life to. The weight of the evening crashed over him in relentless waves, the silence that met his arrival, the wine glasses that whispered of shared intimacies, the look on Camilla's face when their eyes met. A noise snapped him from his thoughts. The front door creaked open, and Max's body stiffened instinctively. Camilla stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light of the house. The robe that had seemed so defiant before now appeared fragile, like she was holding on to the last threads of her defense. "Max." Her voice barely carried to where he stood, but he heard it. It was laced with desperation, an ache that he might have responded to once, a long time ago. He didn't turn to face her, didn't trust himself to look back. The resolve that had carried him this far was thinning, and he knew better than to test it. "I'm sorry," she called, the words broken, wavering in the cold air. They reached him, but instead of softening the hard knot in his chest, they twisted it tighter. An apology was too little, too late a patch for a wound too deep to mend. Max slid into the driver's seat and shut the door, the sound decisive and final. The ignition hummed to life under his hand, a steady purr that drowned out the faint noise from the house. Camilla's figure blurred through the window, a ghostly outline of what once was. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as he stared ahead, hands gripping the wheel. As he backed out of the driveway, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The house receded into the dark, a silhouette against the backdrop of the night. But Camilla's form remained by the door, unmoving, watching as he drove away. The road stretched before him, empty and uncertain, but at least it was his to follow now. The grief would come later, for now there was only the road and the roar of the engine carrying him into the unknown. The night swallowed him up, the world outside a blur of dark shapes and cold light. The first tremor of realization shuddered through him, the knowledge that life as he knew it had just shifted irreversibly. The road unfurled before Max, dark and endless, a ribbon of asphalt lit only by the dim glow of his headlights. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white as he fought to contain the storm that churned inside him. The landscape whipped by in a blur of shadowed trees and empty fields, each mile stretching the distance between him and the shattered remnants of his life. The silence in the car was deafening, punctuated only by the low hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires meeting the uneven road. Max's mind raced, replaying the scene in his home with brutal clarity. The disbelief had dulled, replaced by a raw, gnawing ache that threatened to break free. He tightened his jaw, fighting back the surge of emotion. This wasn't the time for feeling, he told himself. This was the time for action, for surviving the night intact. A sudden pang of doubt pierced through his thoughts. Had there been signs he'd missed? Quiet moments where Camilla had seemed distant or too quick to smile at a text she wouldn't share. The memories came back now, jagged and cruel. Her late returns from girls' nights, the occasional slip of a name he hadn't recognized. He had brushed them off, trusting her implicitly. Trust how naive it felt now, how costly. The night pressed in tighter, and Max struggled to find focus, his eyes darting to the dashboard clock. The green digits glared back at him, mocking with their normalcy, 2:13 a.m. Every second felt elongated, infused with a weight he hadn't noticed before tonight. A hollow laughter bubbled up in his chest, but he swallowed it back, leaving only silence in its wake. Ahead, the road widened as the lights of a small, all-night diner came into view. It was a place he'd passed many times but never entered. Tonight, it seemed like a sanctuary, a brief reprieve from the inky void pressing at his thoughts. He pulled into the gravel lot, the crunch of stones beneath his tires grounding him for the first time in hours. The fluorescent sign flickered, casting pale light over the cracked parking lot. He turned off the engine, the abrupt absence of noise almost jarring. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the worn sign that spelled Manny's Diner in faded neon. The quiet of the car became suffocating, and he pushed open the door, stepping out into the chill air. The cold wrapped around him, biting through his shirt and sinking into his bones. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. A lone waitress, her hair pulled back into a tired bun, glanced up from behind the counter, offering a polite, detached smile. Max nodded briefly, sliding into a booth near the window. The worn seat squeaked under his weight, and he exhaled, the breath shuddering out of him like an unraveling thread. He stared down at the sticky menu, not seeing the list of breakfast platters and coffee options. His reflection in the window caught his eye, faint and ghostly, superimposed on the dark road outside. It was a face he barely recognized, tired, drawn, eyes haunted by the collapse of everything he once believed solid. The diner hummed with a low, persistent quiet, broken only by the faint clink of cutlery and the muted rustle of the waitress's apron as she moved behind the counter. Max sat motionless, staring through his reflection at the dark expanse beyond the window. He felt like a man caught between worlds, the secure past that no longer existed and an uncertain, uncharted future. The ache in his chest had dulled, replaced by an exhausting numbness that seeped into his very bones. A coffee cup clattered onto the table, jerking him back into the present. The waitress, her eyes ringed with the fatigue of the night shift, gave him a look that hovered between concern and indifference. "Refill?" she asked, her voice flat but not unkind. He blinked at the cup, realizing it had already been emptied without him noticing. "Yeah, sure," he muttered. She poured with practiced efficiency, the dark liquid swirling like ink. The steam rose, curling up and dissipating into the air, vanishing as swiftly as the life he once knew. Max wrapped his hands around the warmth, letting it seep into his cold, stiff fingers. The silence weighed heavily on him, pressing down with the unresolved conversations and final goodbyes he hadn't voiced. He thought about calling someone, anyone, just to feel a connection to the world that still spun on, indifferent to his personal collapse. But who would he call? His parents were states away, friends distant and unaware. No, this was his burden alone, and for now, that suited him fine. The bell above the diner door chimed as a new patron entered, breaking the static calm. Instinctively, Max glanced up, eyes narrowing at the figure, a trucker, judging by the worn cap and heavy boots. He turned his attention back to his coffee, taking a slow sip that burned pleasantly against his tongue. A faint tremor rippled through him, unexpected and telling. It wasn't from the cold or the weariness, it was from the realization that he was no longer tethered to anything. The idea brought a surprising mix of dread and freedom. His mind traced the days ahead, phone calls to lawyers, discussions that would cement the finality of his marriage's end. He felt the faint stir of anger again, but it was weak, too battered to flare into anything more. He set the cup down and let his gaze wander to the laminated menu, focusing on the mundane details as an anchor. The specials hadn't changed in years: pancakes, scrambled eggs, a burger named after someone long forgotten. The simplicity of it seemed almost mocking. Here, life went on unblemished, moving in its familiar steady rhythm. The waitress passed by again, eyes flicking to him with silent questions she never voiced. He met her gaze briefly and managed a thin, fleeting smile, as if to say, "I'm fine, don't worry." But they both knew it was a lie, and she moved on without pressing further. Outside, the sky lightened from ink black to a soft slate gray. Dawn was creeping in, indifferent and unstoppable. The world was waking up, and soon the diner would fill with early risers, truckers, and locals craving warmth and routine. Max watched the faint, stubborn glow of morning spread across the horizon and took a deep breath. It was time to leave this hollow place, time to step into whatever came next. He stood, sliding a few bills under the edge of his plate. The waitress glanced over, a nod of acknowledgement shared between them. With one last look at his reflection, now pale and resolute, Max pushed open the door and stepped into the chilled air, ready to face whatever remained of the day.